Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar. I'm Jenny Bailey from the Agile Business Consortium. We're a not-for-profit member organisation who are leading, promoting and enabling business agility worldwide. As with all our webinars, we're recording this broadcast, so everyone who's registered will receive this in their follow-up email and also the slides from the presentation. Now, also, we like to keep discussions flowing here when I'm doing our webinar series, and so if you have questions, please send them through to us. They'll come through onto this go-to platform and I'll be able to see them and I'll put them to my guest at the end of the presentation if we have time. We always have a few time constraints, so if we have time, I'll get as many questions as I can through to my guest. So without further ado, I should probably introduce to you our guest for this morning. It's Jeremy Renwick, who's the CxO from Agilesphere. And only last week, Jeremy and I were at the Agile on the Beach presentation, weren't we?
We were.
Down in Falmouth.
Yes, indeed. Good fun.
So, Jeremy, lovely to have you here in the studio, or our boardroom, as we call it. We kind of turn it into a makeshift kind of studio. Thank you for spending the time with us. And we're really looking at the concept of minimum viable organisation, aren't we?
We are indeed, yeah.
Now, this was a presentation you gave at Agile on the Beach, and it went down extremely well, didn't it?
Yes, and it was a follow-on from the Agile Business Conference last autumn.
That's right.
So there's a video on the ABC website which sort of gives that presentation as well if people want it as background and those sorts of things.
There is indeed, yeah. It's on the conference website. It's a past conference, so it's there. Also, obviously, if you've registered nice and early, as of from 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, you would have also received the picture book we sent out. And I think the whole thought process behind that is the fact that this concept is vast, isn't it, Jeremy?
Oh yeah, no, it is. The more you tease away at it, the more richness there is to expose.
That's right. So we wanted to give you a little bit of extra content, a little bit of reading material for you to understand some of the concepts, the components that we're going to be talking about today, so you can follow along and also obviously point some questions in our direction. That's no problem at all. So let's move on with the presentation. So yeah, Jeremy Renwick is obviously the CxO of Agilesphere. Now that started back in 2013, didn't it?
Yes, it did. We created the brand in 2013. Agilesphere became a thing, an LLP at the tail end of 2013. A thing.
Yeah, more than
sorry, that's a GDS thing. Sort of show the thing.
It became live.
It became something.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, and obviously we've got a very long history with Agilesphere, haven't we, here at the Consortium?
Yes, we have. So Hugh Ivory, one of my fellow CxOs, has been involved in the Consortium for many years. He was one of the authors of DSTM Return, and was on the board for a few years as well. Mm-hmm. I've been going to the conferences since 2007, and we've been intimately involved in the creation of Agile digital services off the back of the work that we were doing at the Ministry of Justice. Absolutely,
and that was, of course, the last webinar we did with Peter Stansbury, who's the lead author, who works at Agilesphere.
Indeed, the prof.
It's all connected, isn't it?
The prof, yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. I mean, looking at your bio there, obviously you've had a lot of experience working in digital services right the way through, and obviously the Ministry of Justice is very much clear, because obviously you work very closely with them, don't you?
Yes, we do.
And through that experience, obviously, there came that opportunity, because they offered the Agile DS, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
Which was fantastic. So we're not here necessarily to talk about digital services today, although it's all kind of relatively connected, isn't it? But we're here to talk about the MVO, and this is a concept that you've been working on for some time. You've been researching it and looking at it, and it's really come about through the experience of working in large organisations and digital transformations. The whole idea of MVO, hasn't it?
Yes, it is. So it sort of comes back to the frustration I found as a delivery manager, as a program manager, in terms of implementing in an agile way, that you get so far in an organisation, you'd have some success, you get so far, and then you ran into the conflict between agile ways of working and traditional ways of working outside of IT. Mm-hmm. The first time I sort of really crystallised the problem was 2014. In that you effectively, what you're trying to do is to get people to focus on the end-to-end delivery of value in digital services, and they cut across all of the functional areas in a traditional organisation, and there's that clash between focusing on the delivering of value and traditional organisations that are focused on functions, sort of sales, marketing, IT, finance, as an example.
Okay. So the minimum viable organisation isn't like a one-man band, is it? That's not the minimum necessarily. So how would you, if you could kind of put it in a nutshell, because we like nutshells to begin our webinars here, how would you define minimum viable organisation?
So within an organisation, you need a part of the organisation that's delivering the current value, that's sort of generating the profit or justifying the taxes, if we're talking about the public sector.
Sure.
That's delivering the current value to the broader environment, so the citizens in public services, the consumers in private business. And so that delivers the current value. Now, as Kodak found out, you need to also keep an eye on the changes in the environment. As I say, here are the big threats that might be coming out of the environment, here are the big opportunities that might be coming out of the environment, and what the impact on today's business is actually going to be. And then you need to tie that all together within an ethos and identity that says this is who we are, this is what we're about, this is us.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, so obviously the system that we have currently then is a little bit broken, isn't it? And the old model is broken. That's what we're kind of referring to currently, which is, I mean, describe the old model if we can. Let's talk about that for a little bit.
Okay, so the old model is basically a functional-based organisation where you have a function or a silo that is sales, or possibly sales and marketing. You'll have operations, you'll have IT, you'll have finance, you'll have HR. That's the sort of classic hierarchical silo-based organisation that's been around since. Well, you can sort of say been around since forever, but realistically, it got sort of codified at the beginning of the 20th century with people like Ford and General Motors. And it's worked. Let's be clear here. It worked very well through certainly the first half of the 20th century, and you had some very long-lived organisations. So the average lifespan of a company in the first half of the 20th century was about 80 years.
Right.
Since then, the average lifespan of a company has dropped to 10 years. It doesn't matter whether that's big or small. There's a link in the picture book that takes you to some research along these sorts of lines. So they're not. So if we come down to the word viable, the old organisation structure isn't viable.
Okay.
And so it can't cope, and because it can't cope with the complexity, frequency, and pace of change, it doesn't change quickly enough.
Okay.
And there are lots of underground reasons for that. The other part about what the problem is at the moment is that ultimately the silos have somebody at the head of those silos, and people look. And because they have so much control over those individuals, and ultimately they're people paying you, they're people rewarding you, they're where your personal and business and professional development come from, everybody looks up the silo.
Right.
And everybody looks up the silo, and because it's a hierarchy, then the individual behavioural characteristics of the organisation, of the people at the top, get reflected down the organisation. So both the good and the bad.
Sure.
And of course, the guys at the top tend to be white, male, pale, and stale.
Yeah.
So we
I like it.
They tend to be male, pale, and stale, and that then reflects itself right the way through the organisation. Okay. Now, you could probably no, I won't say what I was going to say there. The key thing is that ultimately in today's digital business, with a fast pace of change, you have to focus on the customer.
Yes.
If all of your organisation isn't focused on the customer, it's focused on the CFO, the CMO, CEO, the C-suite, then you're not focused on the customer.
I think we should also mention, though, it's not like a black and white situation, is it? It's not like it's either one way or the other way. There are organisations out there where that's the norm, but they're all trying to change. They know change is afoot. They know the current climate. They know they need to change. So it's not like that. The old style is happening and the new style is happening. There's lots of differences in between as well, isn't there?
There is.
There's a huge paradigm shift.
There is a huge paradigm shift, but. And I'll come to my third point on this slide, is that the old model has a habit of reasserting itself. And this is because everybody's mental models, including myself, are are formed by the fact we've all been brought up in siloed hierarchies.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so that's all we see. That's all we see. So when we're under pressure, or there's any kind of stress, or there's something new happening, you'll reach for the old model because there's no mental model there.
Sure.
And I think so. First things first, I think we all need to just sort of be gentle on ourselves and sort of say, very few of the people I've ever run into in these sorts of situations are bad people.
Of course.
I don't think I can actually think of one. They just have a mental model that's outdated. And then I realised that I also had a bunch of mental models that were outdated as well. So the key thing is, and what I'm trying to do here is to provide a different mental model.
Right.
So that we can actually compare a different mental model, a new mental model, with the old mental model, and sort of say, okay, which bit, if we want to do digital business, which way is the right way to do it?
Right.
Which bits of the old do we need to retain?
Sure.
And where do we need to apply new ways of thinking and new mental models to do that? So that when people have heard about this, they then sort of say, okay, we're in this situation, we've got some conflict. What could we see in a different mental model and the minimum viable organisation model?
Okay, well let's move on and look at the minimum viable organisational model, viable systems model for a start.
Okay,
this has been going for some time, hasn't it?
Yes, it is. So, viable systems model was developed by a guy called Stafford Beer in the late 60s and early 70s from the research and some of his consultancy work into sort of large organisations and particularly around the management of complexity. So he derived the model because I think he spotted that things weren't right.
Back in the 1970s.
Back in the 1970s. Wow. Well, if you think back that far, you're probably not that old. But if you think back that far, Britain was the sick man of Europe in terms of industrial disputes and all that sort of stuff. There was a lot of evidence that maybe we weren't doing things quite as well as we should be.
Right.
Anyway, this got distracted down that rabbit hole. But what he did is he went and did some complexity mathematics, which is the picture on the right, and he derived this model out of complexity mathematics. He also derived the model out of the human nervous system. So he did it completely separately, came to the same model. And the reason why he chose the human nervous system is human beings are the most viable systems on the planet in that we've only succeeded because we can adapt faster than other species on the planet.
Right.
Right,
fair enough.
And so he derived it from the human nervous system, particularly the autonomous human nervous system. And out of that emerged a whole raft of concepts we would now consider to be agile.
Right.
So he was talking about empowerment and feedback and focus on value in his books in the early 70s. Now, the challenge with viable systems, so I've been a systems thinking before I was an Agilist.
Okay.
And so I tried applying VSM in the late 90s and early noughties and just couldn't quite work out how to apply it. So I just left it go. This
movement, as it were.
This other bandwagon called Agile sort of picked me up and carried me along.
Right.
And then I started seeing patterns emerging particularly in the work around digital services, that started looking systemic and particularly with the focus on feedback and focus on the user needs. That really resonated with the VSM model. And then last summer, when I actually managed to get some time off, I realised that we do actually have many of the components from the digital services world, and that's where this all came from.
Okay, so we've just skipped one, obviously, but we were talking about we have many components, and it's interesting that you were saying that. So here we are then. This is the start, if you like, of a set of slides that's really going to be displaying and detailing the MVO, isn't it?
Yeah.
So here we've obviously got a multidisciplinary team.
Multidisciplinary team, but particularly including including the rest of the business.
Right.
And this is where the Agile Business Consortium has always been spot on the money, in that it isn't a technology thing, it is about the whole business. So in a startup, you'll end up with a bunch of tech, or particularly a lead startup, you'll end up with a bunch of tech. You will need somebody sort of making sure that we're making money or spending the investors' money wisely. And then quite often there'll be some offline components and non-digital components. In this slide, I'm using assisted digital in the GDS terms, but obviously with a bricks and clicks enterprise, you'll be shipping a book, shipping a CD. Gosh, nobody ships CDs anymore, but shipping
the products,
shipping groceries,
yes,
or anything along those lines. But the key thing is you're focused on the customer and you're delivering them value every couple of weeks, new value every couple of weeks, and obviously you're receiving value back from them, because ultimately, unless you're delivering value and receiving the value back, either in terms of money or in terms of data that you can sell to advertisers or something along those lines, you're getting the value back, and that loop is as tightly bound as you possibly can.
Okay, and the feedback loop is working as well. Okay, so that makes sense.
So the challenge comes. The challenge comes when you try to scale. Now, a lot of people would argue, well, why do you need to scale? Keep it as small as possible. Reality is that you go around asking entrepreneurs, and I've asked a lot of entrepreneurs this question over the last year or so, is what do they consider to be the right size for a business?
Okay. And
everybody comes back to say a resilient business is one that is, about £50 million, sort of two to sort of 600 people, because you can manage the loss of one big client and one or two big clients. You can manage a reasonably big shift in the environment, all of those sorts of things. So you do have to scale. You do have to scale. And obviously in the public sector, you have no choice but to sell, because ultimately you're dealing with 50 million, in our case, sort of, 60 million people, and then some fairly important services. So the key thing there is you have to provide some coordination when you're trying to scale. You have to provide some coordination between those sorts of things. Otherwise you don't get any economies of scale, or you end up with the individual value streams potentially competing against each other, particularly for good people.
Okay.
And the thing I realise is actually we do know how to do this.
Yes.
Okay, we know how, when we've got multidisciplinary teams as an agile community, we know how to coordinate. We know how to coordinate between them. So we have things like Scrum of Scrums. We have things like the 3 Amigos sessions, or the 9 Amigos if you've got 3 teams. But particularly we've got things like communities of practice. Okay. So we got rid of the silos in IT, or Agile software organisations got rid of the silos in IT and we ended up with the multidisciplinary teams.
Yes.
But what we said is we still need a way of we still need communities of practice to set standards, to provide professional development, to sort of basically exchange good ideas and all of those sorts of things. So we know how to do that. Now the key thing is, wouldn't it be really nice if our finance colleagues would do something similar? Would it be really nice if our HR colleagues would do something similar?
Sure.
And that way we can embed the finance expertise in the organisations.
Yes.
Sorry, in the value streams.
Right. Yeah.
And they then become closer to the customer. Now, this was the finance vertical. The finance vertical was which was the real trigger for this landing, is that I realised that we'd created a finance silo within Agilesphere as our client base has grown up.
Right.
So we've got 3 big clients, lots of little ones as well. We've got 3 big clients. All of them in the public sector.
You're right.
Each one of them requires different invoicing and different reports around the invoice.
Right. Okay.
And we were having problems with cash flow in that our invoices were getting stuck. Not because they didn't want to pay, not because they loved our service, all the rest of it.
Sure.
Because we hadn't customised our invoicing to the particular needs of the clients.
Customer centric.
So we needed to embed that customer centric knowledge in there.
That makes sense.
Okay, so you've got to embed the customer centric knowledge as close to the client as you possibly can. Now, a similar sort of thing with people. A very similar sort of thing with people is that every client requires different things around people.
We're not all the same. It makes perfect sense.
Makes perfect sense. Yeah. So really, what you need to do is to embed the people expertise, the finance expertise, the ops expertise in the teams, and then bring them together allow them to customize what they do to the end client.
Okay.
And then put in a community of practice to share best practice, to standardize where sensible.
Yes.
While still allowing you to customize where necessary.
Yeah. And your customers will love you for it. That's
certainly what we're trying to achieve. Most of our customers love us. Actually, no, they do. Their customers do love us.
And a heap load of coordination and communication and good culture and all that.
So coordinations and culture is a very important point. So the other thing, so when you've got this, these teams don't exist in a vacuum,
right?
And they need to be empowered. And we mean financial empowerment here, okay? And of course, the bit that Agilists tend to forget when they're talking about empowerment is you're spending other people's money, and there needs to be some accountability about it. It's a straight bargain. I delegate this budget to you. And I expect you to give me back this sort of value, or the team sort of says, give us this budget and we reckon we can deliver this value for you. And you need to do it on the same sort of feedback cycles or matching feedback cycles to what you're doing with the clients. So if you're doing 2-week sprints, delivering value to the clients in 2 weeks, then your empowerment and accountability cycle needs to be no more than 2 sprints. For 4 weeks, typically a month.
Sure, absolutely.
And this is where the beyond budgeting movement really comes in, is because there's a bunch of accountants that realise that the old ways of doing things really aren't very good, and they've got some really interesting ideas and techniques to sort of say, well, okay, let's look at the budget on a rolling forecast type basis.
Yes.
In Agile, we know we can only really plan 3 months in advance.
Yes.
So why are we doing budgets
for a year?
More than 3 months in advance.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so beyond budgeting is really important from that perspective. We're really lucky in that Steve Mortledge, who's one of the leading lights in the beyond budgeting movement, is advising us and helping us with this. I understand he's also helping the consortium too. So
we did a webinar with him actually as well. So he really gave us the concepts of beyond budgeting, and the analogy that we all remember from that one was the horse racing.
Yes.
You wouldn't go and bet on a horse without kind of seeing it and make sure it's not a donkey, for instance.
Well, indeed.
So it's an estimating process.
It's an estimating process. So beyond budgeting is really good from an empowerment and accountability perspective, because ultimately we're looking at those feedback cycles in a shorter pace of time. The other thing you need to do is, if you're empowering people, you need to be able to just do the managing by walking about thing of being able to just sort of sense check that actually what I'm being told is actually what's really going on. And the best way to do that is transparency.
Yes.
And of course, we know how to do transparency in the Agile movement because we stick stuff on the walls.
We do. We love our post-its, don't we?
We love a good post-it. We love a good post-it. And so we stick things on the wall, and we encourage people to come to us and sort of and see what's going on and why we're doing about it. And the more transparency there is, so transparency is the disinfect. It's like sunlight disinfecting. If there is anything a bit dodgy going on, the best way to make sure that it isn't is transparency. Now, what we're actually really talking about here is governance.
Yeah.
All of these are aspects of governance, and we do know how to do governance in an agile way. I put the governance principles for service delivery on up there. Hugh and I were part of the team that developed that while we were at GDS. There are obviously other governance sort of frameworks. Other governance frameworks as well, but Agilists have actually got to grips with this, and so we know how to do governance in the new way. And we can point. It's been very useful in terms of pointing senior leaders to the fact that Agile doesn't have any control. Agile doesn't have any control. Well, actually, it's controlled, but in a different way.
That's exactly right. I mean, it's been a myth, hasn't it, that Agile's like a free-for-all, as it were, no governance in there at all, and no necessarily leadership, I guess. But with the Consortium itself, we've done a lot of work in this area as well, around the principles of leadership and Agile culture. And to do Agile right, there has to be governance, doesn't there?
There does, and this is why I was attracted to DSDM in the day at the very first time, is that ultimately to be able to allow teams to develop in a way that was more effective for software, you had to change the governance principles. At the time, Scrum and XP just had nothing in this area, and DSDM provided an ideal framework at the appropriate level of rigor.
Mm-hmm. That's the Agile Project Framework.
Yeah, well, what is now the Agile Project Framework,
That's right, yes. Which is now evolved into Agile PM and all the other products that we were working on. Yeah. That's in the framework for business agility that we're working on. And that back in the day, I guess you're talking early 90s there, aren't you?
So personally, I'm talking about 2005.
Right.
So that was when the Agile bandwagon came along and picked me up.
Okay, I see.
But obviously, there's a long history before that.
There is indeed, absolutely. Okay, so we've got the governance.
Yeah. So we've got the governance. So this sort of just will build itself back up again into the first picture of the minimum viable organisation. So we're talking about. So when I talked right at the beginning about the definition, we need a system for spotting the big changes in the environment and being able to react to them appropriately.
Yes.
So Kodak's the obvious example. There are other examples even within the digital online community. But think about MySpace.
Absolutely.
As an example.
Just to clarify, going back to Kodak, obviously they were the first one to do digital cameras, weren't they?
They were, but what they didn't do is follow through on that in a way that allowed them to adapt themselves. So Kodak had this huge business in terms of wet film.
That's right. Yeah.
That they had to protect. So the inside and now of the organisation, today's business, turned around and sort of said, well, we don't want any of this digital stuff because it'll undermine our existing business.
Yeah.
And of course, other people then took it and sort of said, oh, I'll tell you what we'd really like to do is to undermine Kodak's wet film business. And obviously there was all of the advantages to the advantages to the consumer as a result of it. And Kodak just never adapted. So they may have had an intelligence and innovation function that actually created this thing. What they didn't do is have a proper conversation with the inside the organisation, today's business, to say, at some point this thing is going to replace wet film.
That's right.
And we need to be able to react to it. So that's the sort of really the next point is you need to be that's really the next point is you need to be having this massive conversation between what's going on in the future and what's going on now. So intelligence, innovation, and what's going on now.
Yes.
Sort of all of the governance, empowerment, coordination. And you need to do that within a framework of what ethos it is, because there will be some opportunities that you take a look at and sort of say that's not for us.
Yeah, sure.
And I saw a report just last week. I wish I could remember what it actually said. That sort of said one of the things that's really important in the 21st century is for people to be doing business the way that people want them to do business. You've got this thing with Elon Musk at the moment, where he made one tweet and he's out.
That's right.
He will go the same way as Travis Kalanick.
You think he's out?
Oh yeah, he's out.
Really?
Yeah, he's out of Tesla. I guarantee you he's out of Tesla.
Wow, you heard it here first.
You heard it here first, because it will be the beginning. It will be the beginning of the end. There will be activist investors that will basically be thinking that Elon Musk has been too big for his boots, and that's a reasonable statement given what he's involved in too many other things. Tesla's got a whole bunch of problems at the moment in terms of quality, in terms of actually being able to get enough Model S's out. They've got a whole bunch of competitors. The traditional people that are now producing some very good electric cars,
absolutely.
BMW particularly.
Yeah, they've watched the path almost, haven't they?
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
And the investors, there will be a group of investors in Tesla that will already be wanting Elon Musk out, and they'll use this to get him out. Completely unacceptable tweet to do. What on earth he thought he said he was trying to do to get involved in it?
I agree. I do agree. I heard it on the news this morning, and I mean, if he's apologised, which obviously he's clearly apologised, but it just seemed crazy.
And it's because so this almost refers it straight the way back to the beginning. The behaviour of the guys at the top get amplified by the old organisation, and so therefore the whole organisation behaves in that sort of way. Uber's the best example of that currently, or recently. You could go back to Steve Ballmer at Microsoft and the difference in the way that Microsoft's behaved with the new chief exec. And
It's the culture, isn't it?
You've got to tie it all together with ethos, identity, and purpose. You've got to really tie it together within that. The best example of this, and the one that I used at the Agile Business Conference, is Bell Pottinger. They thought it was they thought it was a good idea to take a bit of business to run a racist PR campaign in South Africa, and they thought they wouldn't get spotted. And you go,
it's just mind blowing.
It is, but because there was a failure of ethos and identity.
Do they not have PR departments, these people?
Well, PR departments having PR departments.
Oh, it's just crazy.
Well, that's a meta concept.
Very much so. But it's just crazy. I mean, common sense would tell you not to go anywhere near anything like that.
And common sense would sort of say, don't send the tweet that Elon Musk said. Common sense would sort of say to Travis Kalanick, taking on every single regulator around the world probably isn't a good idea. Allowing a misogynist culture to build up in Uber wasn't a good idea.
Twitter's got a lot to answer for, hasn't it?
Well, but Twitter is transparent, but it's a transparency thing. Twitter is actually important in terms of providing transparency around governance, and one of the best tools we've got available to do that. Not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a good place to start.
It's how you use it, really, isn't it? Yeah. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
Okay, then. So let's look at these three components. Yeah. So this really makes it up, doesn't it?
So what I'm sort of saying here is that this is the model I'm trying to provide here is a truly human organisation in that it removes that element we've just been talking about as of one person, amplifying their personality all over the rest of the organisation. Certainly diminishes it. Doesn't necessarily remove it, but it provides the right sort of checks and balances and so on. It's a truly adaptive organisation in that it can spot the changes in the environment and be able to adapt, and provides the right balance between what's going on in the future and what's going on currently. Okay. And that's the particular area I'm trying to focus on at the moment, is really enabling that.
Okay.
And one of the things that I've realised, and one of the reasons I've bolded the thing there, is that I've realised that actually that's the key thing about it, is about adaptation. And so I'm rebranding this, so the minimum viable organisation concept words. People have always had a bit of a problem with, in that it's not really what I've just described is not really minimum.
No, that's right.
It's not small. It's not small.
And like you said as well, we've got almost this in three parts almost.
Yeah, it's really quite small.
Yeah.
Genuinely, the minimum viable organisation is one individual.
Yes,
because
one man band.
because it's derived from the human nervous system.
Fair enough.
You can scale it all the way down to that. But if you're talking about proper organisation, then it's actually, so it isn't really minimum. Viable is always a difficult word. It's just one of those words that is difficult. And minimum viable anything, unfortunately, gets stuck in the IT ghetto because we've talked about minimum viable products so much, because we've talked about minimum viable releases, those sorts of things. David Taylor gave me the feedback back at the conference. He sort of said, when you write your book, do you want it to be on the IT shelves, or do you want it to be on the general business shelves? So I've been so I've come to using the adaptive organisation phrase to describe this, because actually that's what we're really trying to deal with, is adaptation.
Okay.
And of course, the word adapts and adaptation was the other alternative when the Agile Manifesto people decided to choose the word Agile.
Right.
So the conference presentation in October. I know I need to send you the updated details.
You do indeed. We'll get that in time. That's fine.
It will be around the adaptive organisation rather than minimum viable.
Adaptive organisation.
Adaptive organisation just happens. Yeah, adaptive organisation. The other point about this is it's scalable, and you can see I haven't gone into that particular aspect of this in any detail, but the fact we've talked about it being a human, based on the human, you can scale up from one person to a team of people, and then it iterates round, or sort of recurses round. Horrible word, recursive too, but most people understand the concept of recursion. So you can actually scale it up quite a long way, but that's to do with the way complexity mathematics works. And again, that would be the subject of a whole another hour at the minimum.
That's right. Well, that's what we were thinking of doing, actually. Obviously, this is the definition and working through the minimum viable organisation, or the adaptable organisation, as we're calling it now. But we were thinking of doing another one, weren't we, in the future, to actually relating that within the organisation and the scalability of it.
Yeah. So what I was touching on at Agile on the Beach, and I did have to scamper through it a bit at Agile on the Beach, is we've been applying these ideas within Agilesphere, because ultimately it isn't reasonable to expect clients to buy this stuff off us unless we've actually do it ourselves. I know other large consultancies do that sort of thing, but that's not part of our ethos and identity. And it's produced some very, very interesting things. It really brought home this thing about mental models,
right?
And how easy it is to just lapse back into silo thinking.
Yes.
How easy that was the big takeaway we've had over the last sort of 2 or 3 months.
Well, like you said before, that's the comfortable place you go to when there's uncertainty, really, isn't it?
Uncertainty, stress, lots of stuff going on. We've recruited, we've got about 100 people, but we've recruited a team of now 11 internally. To manage that business and provide a platform for growth, and we've had to integrate lots of people in a relatively short space of time, and that's been whilst trying to implement this at the same time, which is it's okay. It has its moments.
Are you at different locations as well? You're not all at one location?
No, so we've got a big team up in Newcastle, and we've got a big team in central London, and then a big team down in Croydon. Those are our three major locations. That was the other thing that I represented at AATB, is that's the other big real learning, is you've got to do Agile well before you start. You've got to do Agile well before you start really trying to adapt the organisation. And you've got to solve things like remote working. So I talk about shrapnel shields,
right?
So that there's a more earthy term for it that most people would know.
Right, gotcha.
So in most Agile organisations, the idea is that the delivery manager and the senior leadership team have got to provide the shrapnel shield to allow the team to actually get on and deliver.
Yes.
When you are the senior leadership team, there's nobody to provide you with a shrapnel shield.
No.
So you actually have to deal with all of the rubbish that you're protecting the teams with, protecting the teams from. So you do have to learn how to deal with remote working. You do have to learn how to deal with part-time availability. You do have to learn to deal with incoming interruptions and those sorts of things. And those are all, dealing with those in an agile way is really quite an advanced topic. And we stray from the path of good, and we've come back to the path of righteousness.
I think that's all good, though. I mean, you're not just talking it, you're walking it as well, which in a lot of respects, so are we when we come to the case for business agility and our big transformation program that we've been doing here.
Absolutely. And
I think it's valuable, hugely valuable.
Well, I think it's essential. You're not authentic and credible.
No, absolutely.
And authenticity is just so important in today's marketplace. And coming back to the importance of ethos, identity, and purpose.
Absolutely. All that trust and transparency and all those values that we hold so dear in terms of an agile organisation. Yeah. And then you can put your hand on your heart and say you are an agile organisation. Yeah, and we can do the same.
And it's the only way you can move at pace. Unless you've got let's bring it all the way back to the beginning here. Is we need to be able to move at pace. There's nothing like sort of politics and conflict and those sorts of things to slow an organisation down.
Absolutely. No, fair enough. Okay, well, that is when we're ending on those 3 points, really, aren't we? The human organisation, the truly adaptive organisation, and a scalable organisation. And through your experience, they really are the cornerstones, as it were, aren't they? That we were discussing. So we've come to the point now where I can put some questions to you. So are you ready?
Of course.
Okay, so we've had some points come through from Ed Holt, actually. I think he's listening down there. I think he's around Cornwall area. So hi there, Ed. He's saying he loves the cartoons, especially the tension between money, the devil, the love, the customer, the angel, all very good, and the ethos, identity, and purpose. Jeremy, do you have any suggestions on how this tension can be managed?
So actually, thank you, Ed. That was one of the points I didn't make. Is of course that we do know how to facilitate those sorts of conversations. So the key thing, and I guess comes back to feedback as such, is that tension comes about typically because those conversations aren't being had regularly enough. Okay. So if there's a bit of tension, a little short conversation to understand, facilitated conversation to understand other people's viewpoints, obviously stops the tension building up. The problem comes is when you don't have that conversation for a couple of months, it blows up into a really big thing. So the key thing is to be having lots of little conversations and not avoiding the difficult ones. And if you need to have an external facilitator or all of them should have a facilitator in.
Right.
Now, most Agilists can self-facilitate a conversation, but what you never get is arrogant enough to think that you can self-facilitate all conversations.
Right.
So you have to be prepared to bring in an external facilitator to deal with the difficult ones where you've got, and the difficult ones are all about money.
Yeah, they seem to be, don't they?
Well, ultimately, because that's when it becomes personal.
Yeah, that's right.
That's when it becomes personal. And so, so Hugh Davina and I have a non-exec guy, Christian Jensen, who's known us for years, who comes in and helps us facilitate those conversations.
Do you have lots of, there's another question coming through, do you have lots of facilitated workshops at Agilesphere? Is that something you work with?
Yes. I would almost say that everything's a facilitated workshop, except that we may not do as much preparation as you might expect from a sort of what you might do for a client and those sorts of things. We'll walk in and sort of say, okay, what is it we're talking about today, and agendarize right from the beginning. So yes, we do have a lot of facilitated workshops. We have a weekly work in progress meeting. That's the key one. Is we have a weekly work in progress meeting facilitated by my colleague Louise, who that looks at everything that we've got going on at the time and looks at what's incoming. The stuff that's I was talking about the shrapnel shield, the shrapnel that's coming in.
Yeah, sure.
The shrapnel that's coming in that we've either got to sort of put up a shield, Game of Thrones like, or dodge, or just. Or just put ourselves in front of and embrace. You know?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Make the most of it and get through it.
Yeah, get through
challenge.
it. Yeah.
Treat it as a challenge, right?
An opportunity every time.
Yeah, exactly. Always an opportunity. Yeah. So there's another question that's come through. How often do you get everybody together? Obviously, you're in 3 locations now. Do you use Skype or Slack channels, that sort of thing, to bring everyone together? So
we very rarely bring everybody together. And we do it basically in the concept of a summer party and a Christmas party, and for everybody that is entirely optional. We do things like an Agilesphere ski trip. We've been talking about doing trips to the cricket and sailing, which we haven't done yet. But basically, the teams on each site are very strongly themselves, and so effectively, what we're saying is that they're almost delegated and empowered themselves. Now, the downside of that is trying to keep consistent identity and ways of doing things around it, and that's very much about facilitating across the sites and bringing together our client principals and sort of the key. Particularly technologists together. There's an element of rotation we do too. So one of our key guys that was working on the Ministry of Justice is now working up in Newcastle with the Overseas Healthcare Service.
Okay.
But it's not. I wouldn't say that we're exemplary at that yet. No, I wouldn't ever say that we're exemplary at it.
Okay, we've got another question coming in. That's great. We're getting loads of questions today. I can understand how a relatively small organisation like Agilesphere, although, like you say, you're 100 people now, 100 employees, can adapt and transform, especially with positive leadership. What has the experience been like for their large government clients?
Yeah.
Good question.
So this was the whole thought process that sort of brought me to this point was triggered by the transformation challenge in central government. So it's the people we work with recognise the problem. The challenge is that the challenge, particularly in the current political environment, is actually how you actually change the organisational structures to align it, because these departments are very, very big. So the short answer is I haven't cracked that one yet.
Right. Okay.
But again, we do have to be. All of the people I've ever met at any level in the civil service are really good people that just want to do a good job for citizens, and they're doing it because because there is not an alternative mental model. That is the way it's always been around things, and we haven't been able to present them with a different way of doing things.
Right.
And so I'm starting to present central government with a different mental model.
Right.
I'm getting some very interesting engagement around it, because what GDS has done over the last 5, 6, 7 years is challenge the civil service to think differently.
Yes. Yes.
But at the moment there's a vacuum.
Yes. And
I'm hoping that the minimum viable organisation, the adaptive organisation idea, and there are others obviously, will help fill that vacuum just to say, yes, we can do this way, and we can do it in an evolutionary way. The big thing the civil service hates is revolution.
Yeah, but I mean, they really need to look at the GDS work and the work they've done with gov.uk, because that was very radical, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
I mean, the whole approach, 10 weeks, and they got a pilot together. That was incredible.
Yes, it was, and was considered to be revolutionary and produced a knee-jerk response.
Yes.
Which resulted in Mike Bracken leaving GDS and Kevin Cunnington coming in, because. I need to be a little bit careful here, but it's my view on these sorts of things is that you need revolutionary ideas, but you always need to implement them in an evolutionary way, because revolutions are always destructive. So what GDS did is created a bubble in terms of how these sorts of things could be done well, and those bubbles have existed in other departments now. So you've got MOJ Digital did it within MOJ. You've got Universal Credit that did it within DWP. But all of these little bubbles created this friction to sort of say we're organised in a fundamentally different way, and we need support from the rest of the organisation in a different way. And that's what's triggered. That's what sort of triggered my thinking. So all of this there's a couple of slides in the deck about in the deck at AOTB, which I first wrote in 2014.
Right.
You've got to commit from being a functionally led organisation to a service led organisation, and that means that the power structures have to change.
That's right.
And you have to sort of say to the people at the top of those power structures what it is, what their role is in the new organisation.
Yeah.
Because this was the other big realisation over the last sort of 5 or 6 months, is that everything that's being done in current organisations probably still needs to be done in some shape, size, and description. They may be a little bit heavyweight. They could do with being shrinking, but the basic outcomes that are happening in the finance silo,
of course,
still need to happen.
Of course, yeah.
What you need to do is to get them focused on the client or the value stream that you're delivering it in, which means embedding it in the team. And coming back to expanding the team to include finance and HR, and
that's where it's going now, isn't it?
And that's where it,
big way.
And that's where it has to be.
Yeah.
But for your teams to be small enough that the finance element and the HR element isn't a full-time job.
No, sure.
And so and that's where the that's where the conflict comes in for us.
Mm-hmm.
Is that this isn't a full-time job?
Mm.
So doing the billing, doing the invoicing, the accounts payable and accounts receivable,
mm-hmm.
even for our biggest client, MOJ,
mm-hmm.
isn't a full-time job.
No, sure.
And so therefore, the temptation is always to sort of say, well, okay, we need one person to do all of the billing across all of our clients.
Yes.
And effectively, you create a one-person silo.
Yes, we're back in the old days almost.
Yeah, but that's because we didn't have a different mental model.
Yes.
So the mental model now is to break those. Let's apply agile principles.
Yes.
Break things into the smallest components,
mm-hmm.
and then prioritize those components according to the business need.
Mm-hmm.
And the business need is for accounts payable, accounts receivable for MOJ to be different to accounts payable, accounts receivable to Department of Health. Yes,
that makes sense. It does make sense.
It's completely logical and it's complete common sense.
Yeah.
But because we don't have a different mental model,
yes.
we lapse back to the old way of doing things.
So it's all about our mental model.
It is all about mental model.
It's that paradigm shift as well, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
And like you said about the culture and the behaviour, it's just so paramount to understand and to have that feeding through an organisation.
Yeah. So the one phrase I haven't used...
I'm interested to know how you do that, actually.
I'll come back to that. Yeah. The one phrase I haven't used here at all is structure drives behaviour.
Okay, sure.
That's so ultimately... it's really, really important. We've banged on about self-organisation, and that is important.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that self-organisation has been taken. People sort of talk about self-organisation, and that's great for some people. But there's a whole bunch of people that like structure.
Yes.
They like roles and all of that sort of stuff. Even within the particularly even within the technology community, because we have a higher proportion of people that are not neurotypical, that are on the autistic spectrum. And if you've got no structure, you will still drive a particular type of behaviour. It's just called chaos or anarchy.
Yes, but it is a type of behaviour.
It is. Right. So no structure drives a behaviour in the same way that any structure drives a behaviour.
Sure.
So therefore, you have to change the structure to be able to enable other behaviours.
Fair enough. That makes a good point, actually. I was interested myself in terms of, obviously, the 3 locations that you've got with Agilesphere, and you have to embed the culture and the understanding, the mission and the vision of the organisation. How do you make sure that's permeated through the organisation?
So for a start, it's recruiting people or bringing people in. We're mainly contractors, which makes it even more difficult.
Right.
In fact, if it wasn't for IR35, we'd all be contractors, but that's a different matter entirely. So it's all about, for us, recruiting people that know how to do digital well, and it's very much around the sort of the and we certainly started off very much recruiting people who know the GDS way of doing digital. As we grow, we are now having to do a lot more in terms of putting an Agilesphere specific flavour. Right. On the top of that, and it's all about communication. So this presentation was rehearsed at each one of our major sites, and the people that are interested, it's all about the coalition of the willing. It's all about
engagement, isn't it?
It's all about, you can't force this down people's throats.
No, sure.
If people want to be engaged, we give them as much opportunity as we can to engage them, but some people just want to come along, do their work, deliver their piece of value for the clients, and then go home or go and work on their own side projects or whatever else it may happen to be. And that's about adaptation.
Of course.
And what we're trying to do with Agilesphere is to provide a platform for people to be able to bring their ideas on, where they can realise that value in a way that's easier than going to angel investors or VCs, or it just sort of sitting on the shelf not doing anything, because that's what happens to most really good ideas. Is they sit on the shelf not going out. So you talk to a lot of the Agilesphere people, they've all had really good ideas that have been done by somebody else.
Right. Is there any such thing as a good idea then? Or a new idea?
No, the new idea. What was the one that came? What was the one that we came up with the other day that somebody was talking about? So the particular example, the particular personal example is my wife and I came up with the idea of an online estate agent in 1997.
Right.
Okay, in 1997, that coincided with our eldest son being born. So that idea sat on the shelf. that idea sat on the shelf.
Understand.
God, what was it that Tom came up with? It doesn't really matter.
It's almost like if you can think it can be done.
Yeah.
Much,
so, but the point is, it's not about the idea.
No.
It's not as much about the idea. It is about the implementation. The instantiation was the word I was going to use, but Alvin Toffler talked about it in PowerShift in 1990, where he sort of said the most valuable person in the new knowledge economy will be the innovator, somebody who combines imaginative knowledge with action. So you have imaginative insights with action, and so it's not the idea; it's the action of actually implementing it that's probably more important. Obviously, no point having you can't do it. You can't do an action unless you've got the idea. But nonetheless, it's all about the action.
So, okay, where can people go to find out more information about this? Obviously, we've given them the picture book, and we can send that out again, can't we, with the follow-up email and the presentation and the slides. Do you recommend any books on this?
So at the back of the slide deck the slide deck in the picture book, the picture book slide deck, is a list of books. So there's a list of Stafford Beer books. I'd recommend they start with Designing the System for Organisations, which is relatively thin. The core material is definitely textbooks, so you've got to be brave about that. The other book that's really worth looking at is The Fractal Organisation by Patrick Hoverstadt, who's speaking at the next conference, I believe, as well. And that's got the best and simplest description of VSM, and obviously I get people to look at the GDS service standard, because actually you do that, and you do that well.
Yes.
You're most of the way down the line. I have a background task to write all of this lot down. which are constantly being distracted from.
I don't think it's going to be minimum by the sounds of it either, is it?
No, I can feel a tone coming on. I want to deliver value. Never. Always think about the thud factor.
Oh, fantastic. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Really appreciate your time talking about the Adaptive Organisation, aka the Minimum Viable Organisation. So I think we've covered a lot. We've covered a lot of that topic, and we'll welcome you back for another webinar, obviously when we want to talk about that again, and its scalability and more along the lines of what you're doing as well.
Well, particularly the implementation stuff. I think that there's some. So what I'm really about is trying to make this as practical as possible. And the sort of example I use is that so much of what we talk about in the Agile movement is about concepts. So you've got other people playing in this space, particularly Frederic Laloux, with what everybody refers to as the Teal model.
Yeah.
And you look at it and you sort of say, okay, how the hell do I actually implement this? It's a bit like. It's a bit like self-organisation. So they say, "Oh, here it is out there. Just sort it out." No. How do you actually implement it? So I have a really good control in this. In that, Davina's an absolutely superb implementation person, but she's got a testing background, so she's not really interested in concepts at all.
Right.
She says, "Okay, so tell me what I can implement.
Right.
How do I actually go off and implement
it?"
And so if I'm coming up with concepts, like the original concept for Agilesphere, and if I come up with concepts, I have to get it to the point where Davina can say, okay, I can see how I can implement that.
And she can then take it from there.
And as a control point, that's great. It's not, it's not a control point, it's not just, it's a really important control point. And we're almost there now. Well, we are there now. We've got a very interesting set of workshops this week on micro roles. I'll just leave that one hanging.
Okay. Well, it's just amazing to hear your journey with Agilesphere, how it's come on, and the organisations that you work with, what you've achieved as well. I think is fantastic. So thank you for sharing that with us this morning.
Well, I also sort of say, I would also say thank you to everybody that's involved in Agilesphere. We'd be here for another 15 minutes if I actually listed everybody, but particularly to Hugh and Davina and Christian. I'm going to list a few: John Michelides, Louise, Roger.
It's like the credits are rolling.
Oh yeah, the credits are going. Gemma and Emily particularly,
and Peter, our dear friend Peter,
and
our
dear friend Peter.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, again, thank you very much for your time this morning. Really much appreciated. I can't even get my words now. Appreciated. Okay, so there's all Jeremy's details. You're more than happy to receive emails and tweets and all the rest of it, as long as they're good tweets, of course.
Well, do have a look at my Twitter feed. There's lots of boats on the Twitter feed.
Oh, that's right. Yes, he's a very avid sailor, aren't you? Because you did sail into Agile on the beach, didn't you?
Indeed,
which was fantastic. So yeah, there's all Jeremy's information. So please do get in contact with him. We like to keep the conversations flowing here. So if you've got further questions, send them through. No problem at all. I've just got enough time to mention that our next webinar is going to be happening at 11 o'clock on Thursday, the 16th of August. It's all about Agile leadership. We're going to be looking at the 9 principles of Agile leadership. And my guest in the studio is Alan Furlong. He's been working with our working group for Agile culture and leadership now for some time. It's doing some amazing research. It really is. So please join me for that one on Thursday, the 16th of August at 11 a.m. But for me, for now, thank you so much for joining us. It's been lovely to have your company. And I should mention there's people on here from all over the world. There's Australia and America and parts of Europe as well. So I really do appreciate you joining us if you've been staying up and listening. I really hope we've given you a lot of valuable information and content. And I will be sending out the recording to everybody that's registered for the webinar also. So for me, for now, thank you very much for listening. Jeremy, thank you again.
It's been fun.
It has been fun. We always like to have fun in the studio. And there's so many topics to cover on this broad spectrum of agility, business agility and Agile, as you can imagine. So, okay, so from me for now, thank you again, and we'll be in touch with you soon. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.